Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Lowe, and I'm a developmental scientist here at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand.
Okay, and I am Joseph Perner at the Department of Psychology and the Center for Neurocognitive Research at the University of Salzburg in Austria.
Okay, in this podcast, Joseph and I will introduce key messages and findings from a range of papers devoted to implicit and explicit theory of mind that will be published in a special issue of the British Journal of Developmental Psychology that's coming out in March 2012, Volume 30, Issue 1. The topic of how children come to understand complex mental states and how they lead to behavior is attracting renewed scientific interest because, as Joseph will discuss next, there is a striking developmental puzzle over children's understanding of false beliefs and erroneous actions.
Right. There is a great challenge right now. The traditional finding was that children don't understand false beliefs and the erroneous or mistaken actions a false belief leads to before something. And now, in the last, starting in 2005, increasing number of findings came up that under certain conditions, even infants as young as 14, 15 months, and one study actually claims 7 months, there is evidence that infants are sensitive to another person's mistaken belief. So the great challenge is how to get those two kinds of data together. And that's what this issue is centrally dealing with.
So when we think about the nature of the observed developmental changes that Joseph was just telling us about, readers can roughly group the papers in the special issue into two broad theoretical positions. So on the one hand, you have the negative release view, arguing that a representational understanding of mind is present from very early in life, but young infants and young children can't make full use of it because of constraints external to their knowledge. So the claim is that the standard false belief task is too complex. It overwhelms young children's information processing resources. However, spontaneous response tasks that simply measure indirect looking, for example, is going to reveal early proficiency because it simply taps, or so the theory goes, into core knowledge of basic principles. So a good demonstration of the negative release view comes from a paper by Herb Balz and Beerjean, whereby they reported that 2.5-year-olds they tested 2.5-year-olds in a verbal anticipatory looking task, where the experimenter gave the anticipatory eye gaze prompt as a self-addressed utterance. So basically, the experimenter looked at the ceiling, had a chin in her hand during and after the prompt. Now, what's amazing about this study is that children gave evidence of false belief understanding in that condition, but they failed when the experimenter looked at the child during and after the prompt. The findings of the other paper by Luca Surian and Alessandra Garassi also support the notion of early competency. So they found that 17-month-olds showed correct anticipatory looking in a false belief situation, even when the agents in their task were morphologically very different from familiar or natural agents. So the agents in their task were just moving geometric shapes. Now, both these studies, the one by He and colleagues and Surian and Garassi, complement the theoretical paper by German and Cohen about the idea of cue encoding. So basically, German and Cohen advocate or advise readers to look closely at and perhaps capitalize on some of the input information. And this could be, say, for example, using self-directed utterances, like in He et al. Study, or maybe objects displaying autonomous movements, for example, in Surian and Garassi study, that is going to best trigger and reveal this early theory of mind competency. The good thing about the special issue is that, in contrast to those papers, the other contributors in the special issue emphasize positive gain, simply meaning that there is some fundamental improvement in basic understanding of what infants and older children know about the mind. And this is what Joseph will turn to discuss next.
Okay, so there are different ways of approaching this issue of what the positive gain in development might be. So one important idea here is the good old distinction between implicit and explicit understanding of something. So the idea is that this early evidence of children's sensitivity to false beliefs is something like an implicit understanding, which in the adult literature is closely linked to unconscious understanding, so that the children anticipate correctly but don't even understand or know that they do make this anticipation. So an important finding actually goes back to one of our research with Wendy Clemens in 1994 or something, where we showed that children, we only could show it with young 3-year-olds and not with infants, but children look where somebody will return, so they expect the person who falsely believes that that his object is in location 1, so their looking goes to location 1, so that they expect him to come back there. Whereas when you ask them where he will go back to, they adamantly claim that he will go to location 2, where the object actually is. So you get a very clear dissociation what their intuitive online looking indicates about their understanding, and when you actually ask them explicitly about what will happen. And because you could say that the looking is an indirect test, that you don't really talk about what will happen, you don't really directly address the issue of what this agent will do, whereas when you ask a question, you do address it directly. And this is a distinction that has been used in the adult consciousness literature to detect unconscious knowledge. So if there is sign that people understand or know something on the indirect measure, but not on the direct measure, then you can conclude that this knowledge they have is unconscious or implicit. So it looks to some degree that this early knowledge may be of this implicit kind. And some of the papers here expand on this. So one question is, if it's implicit, it also tends to be automatic. And there is a paper on adults by Surtees, Appley, and Butterfield, who looked at the difference between, they have a measure of automaticity. So if you see that the other one sees something from a different perspective, and that different perspective then intrudes on your, when you have to act on your reaction time, then that is a sign that you automatically compute the other's perspective. So to make it more concrete, they have a very cute paradigm that you see 2 people, one is your own perspective and the other one is sitting opposite, and on the floor you have a number like 6. So to you, it looks like a 6. To the other one, if you understand it, it looks like a 9. And so a control condition is, for instance, you have the number 8 on the floor. Now an 8 looks like an 8 to both viewers. So there is no interference between what the other one makes of it and what you make of it. And they show that at least with this kind of perspective tasks, there doesn't seem to be an interference between what the other one sees and what you see. And they conclude, therefore, that this level 2 perspective taking, which is involved here, is not automatic. But German and Cohen in one paper discuss a recent publication by Agnes Kovac, who has data showing that adults, as well as 7-month-old infants, do seem to automatically compute the perspective of some bystander, and that perspective influences demonstrably their reaction time to the test event. So there is a certain discrepancy which is discussed in the German and Cohen paper. Another way to look at what another implication of the implicit-explicit difference is that if it is implicit, it may be non-conceptual. So this is a distinction intensely discussed by philosophers. But Rakoczy goes into this in his paper, and he discusses that if it's that the evidence we have at the time of the infant's understanding isn't really enough to claim that they have a conceptual understanding of false belief, because then it must be more flexible. That's one sign of a conceptual knowledge, and the evidence we have is sort of limited to particular cases where one can show it, and not that they can use to argue it flexibly. So there is no, the upshot is of his paper that there is at the time no evidence for a proper concept of belief, which doesn't exclude that they have some knowledge, but based on a non-conceptual grasp of belief. Till Vierkant's paper discusses another interesting potential difference that comes with the implicit-explicit distinction. He picks up on a philosopher's, Moran's, distinction between theoretical and deliberative stance. And this I am partial here, because this reminds me of a distinction that Johannes Rössler and I had in mind in some recent writings of ours, that you can have an understanding of other people simply in terms like you have an understanding of all other things in the world, of inanimate objects that you observe or can be innate, that you have a knowledge of how people usually tend to act. But that is different from how we intuitively approach other people, that we understand the reasons for their acting, and not just understanding that in those situations they act like this. And one idea would be that the early understanding shown in infants is more like this theoretical stance, that they just know about regularities in behavior, including cases where a false belief is created. Whereas what happens later is that they use in Moran's terms, deliberative stance, or in our terms, that they start understanding, or when you ask them how somebody will act, they ask themselves what reasons does the agent have to act, and he will act according to his reasons. And when they do this, then it's only until about 4 years that they understand that sometimes people's reasons, you have to look at their reasons from their perspective, and this they can't do until 4. So this is what till Vierkant goes into. But the aspects of what changes in development are many, and another issue that is discussed, I would call, is a issue of causal depth of understanding, and where the understanding comes from. Is it innate, or is it learned through experience? And here a distinction is usually mentioned that was coined by Dan Povinelli in the context of animal theory of mind, that the animals, he claimed, don't really, or at least to explain the existing evidence, you don't really have to resort to animals inferring from what they see the other one doing right now, what mental state the other one has, and then predict his behavior. You could directly make an inference from the behavior and the situation you observe the other one in, and then have some behavior rules that allow you to predict future behavior. And this without going through the intermediate state of mental states being induced and then leading to the behavior. So you could say characterize the difference between behavior rules and mental rules in terms of causal depth. You could say they both get at similar things, namely understanding how future behavior emerges from the current situation. But and the current situation causes the future behavior. But the behavior rule is a shallow causal connection, There's just a link, whereas a mental theory is a deeper causal understanding of how this comes about. And to really separate those two is a very difficult, empirically very difficult question. And another thing is that because infants are so good so early on, a natural conclusion or sort of tacit assumption behind it is it must be innate because they don't have enough time to learn something as intricate as our mental theory of explaining behavior. But the paper by Ruffman, Tamu-Po, and Perkins makes a good case or points out that there is now more and more evidence of the power of statistical learning. So even in a few weeks or months of life, you get lots of experience where you can see statistical regularity in how people behave and don't behave, and we underestimate the power of that kind of learning, and that even at a few months of age, the statistical learning could in principle lead to very sophisticated understanding. This is also picked up by the paper by Wang et al. And maybe since you, Jason, since you are a co-author of this, maybe you could take over.
Well, in the Wang et al. Paper, what we found was that children in mainland China, so this was a study that for the first time looked at whether children outside of a Western industrialized country would actually show sophisticated eye-gazing or anticipatory looking on false belief tasks. And also show a dissociation between the implicit responses and the verbal responses across not only the unexpected transfer scenario, but also at the same time in the unexpected content scenario and the misinformation task as well.
So maybe we could explain that a bit. So the transfer for the non-expert listener, that an unexpected transfer is that you don't see where your interesting object is relocated, and the unexpected content is that you think there are Smarties in the Smartie box naturally.
That's right.
And you don't know that there is something else in it. Okay, just to make that
exactly.
clear.
And in the misinformation task, someone said, say for example, the packet of biscuits was in, saw that the packet of biscuits was in a particular location, but then didn't see its ultimate transfer, and then told someone else who wanted the packet of biscuits that it was still in its original location, so thereby giving a false information. And so the 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, these were the Chinese children, still showed correct first look, that even when they made incorrect verbal judgments. Now, this says something about the causal depth of learning, but the problem is, as you point out, Joseph, and also pointed out by Ted Ruffman and colleagues, is that statistical learning could also explain the consistency in children's eye-gazing there, that it could generalize across situations.
So one, since we don't have very decisive data to settle the issue between behavior rules and mental rules, plausibility or sort of formal arguments are sometimes put forward. And so, for instance, that behavior rules, you need a lot and very many to explain all the things that infants or also animals can understand. So it seems on the surface plainly implausible that anything as a jumble of knowledge like behavior rules are being used. So Surian and Garachi and He et al. Sort of refer to those arguments. But I think the issue, this argument underestimates the seriousness of the issue, and I called it Povinelli's challenge, because Dan Povinelli sort of informally pointed out that whenever you also need a rule that gets you from the observed behavior to infer the mental state. And when you make that explicit, then you also get a huge jumble of different rules you have to know. And all the the difference between the mental rules and the behavior rules is that you simply, instead of having a rule from the observed behavior to the mental state, you just go directly from the observed behavior to the predicted behavior. And so in terms of complexity and number of rules you need, there is no real difference. So I think it's a bit more of a challenge to this that one could get away with just arguing about the implausibility of it. The implausibility, of course, seems to be there because we don't reflect on the mental rules because this is so natural for us. So we are not aware that using a mental explanation is also bloody complicated. Okay, there's one more thing here that is interesting. The paper by Yot and Poulain Dubois. They made an interesting attempt to get into this issue by training infants on a behavior rule and see whether this has an effect. So I think this is a very interesting idea that one should pursue, although I think their particular first attempt is not very convincing that they actually trained a behavior rule. But it's a very intriguing idea. And before we, so the last point here that comes up with positive gain has to do with the relationship between the early understanding and the later understanding, whether those are totally independent kind of developments or whether there is continuity. And the paper by Termer et al. Clearly shows they get very neat correlations between the early indicators of sensitivity to the unexpected transfer paradigm. They get a correlation between the expectant looking in the right location and the later correct answer to the question where the person will search. But an interesting aspect here is that the correlation seems to be for the, if you use the unexpected transfer paradigm, then you get a good correlation. But the correlation to another paradigm, even at the explicit level, is not particularly impressive. So again, it doesn't really settle much of the issue. One could say this is continuity, saying it must be the same kind of knowledge, that is a mentalistic understanding. But on the other hand, since this is particular, the correlation sticks to the particular paradigms you're using, that actually speaks in favor of behavior rules. So again, just shows how tricky this issue is. And then we have another set of papers that links all these developments to related developments.
Yes. So another source of contention between the positive gain account and the negative release account has to do with the role of executive functioning and the role of language. So, for example, a popular argument for the negative release approach for explaining why children below 3 or, say, 4 years fail the traditional false belief test is that inhibition requirements in that task perhaps mask conceptual competency. And the argument is that by taking away these inhibition difficulties, by removing them, the indirect task is going to reveal early theory of mind proficiency. So the paper by Wang et al. Bears directly on this issue of taking away inhibition demand. So they, again, in their Chinese data, compared implicit gaze anticipations and preschoolers' explicit verbal predictions when the target object in the false belief task was present or absent. So sometimes the protagonist in the story, after removing the object, took it away instead of simply just transferring it to the other location, just removed it from the scene completely. They found that manipulation of object presence or absence had a rather small effect in the expected direction on children's explicit judgment. So these Chinese children, despite having surface executive functioning that is particular to the Chinese cultural group, they still showed, 4-year-olds still showed, were better in their explicit judgments compared to 3-year-olds. Now, the manipulation of the target presence or absence, this effect size was just about the same or perhaps slightly larger for the implicit anticipation measure, children's eye gazing. So this dissociation, this robust dissociation between eye gaze or accurate eye gazing and incorrect verbal responding in a mainland Chinese sample, again, challenges the explanation, the straightforward explanation that the dissociation between looking on the one hand and verbal judgment on the other hand in direct tasks is simply due to the distracting influence of knowing reality. Now, what's intriguing about the Wang et al. Study is that they also found that separate measures of executive functioning correlated with children's direct judgments and not with their indirect gaze anticipation. So this is regardless of executive demand, whether the object was present or absent. Now, this second component of their study does speak to the possibility that direct judgments have some executive demands that indirect looking responses lack. So how could readers make sense of this? Well, a unifying solution, I think, from the Wang et al. Study might be that there is a much more richer, a much more deeper, and more fundamental developmental connection between executive functioning and false belief understanding. So one possibility is that the link between traditional false belief measures and executive tasks reflect the development of, say, common meta-representational insight. The view that Wang et al. Emphasize or are sympathetic to is that perhaps implicit anticipations reflect the operation of a very low-level system that tracks, say, belief-like states instead of full belief representation as such. And developments in executive functioning partly help cultivate the emergence of a high-level explicit system of belief understanding, genuine belief understanding. Now, another two papers, one theoretical and one empirical, also take a much more closer look at the role of executive functioning and language in particular as bearing on the implicit-explicit debate. Now, Valerie Sanwan and Janet Astington side with the positive gain view, and they argue that the implicit knowledge shown in indirect measures is not equivalent to false belief understanding shown in direct measures. Now, they take the view that language plays a powerful representational role in bridging that gap. So in their theoretical paper, they explain how epistemic verbs, say, for example, the word think in the complement syntax frame as illustrated in the example sentence, Fred thinks the toy is in the box. This type of word, the epistemic verb, can help children attend to and perhaps abstract or pull out the relations between belief and action. It may help them remember those relations, perhaps encode those relationships much more deeply and more uniformly across situations, and in doing so, perhaps invite children to make generalized inferences across the different contexts. So in doing so, Sanwan and Astington make the important point that language helps form new understanding, meta-representational understanding. Of course, a better way to disentangle the relationship between language, executive functioning, and theory of mind understanding, because all of these factors develop simultaneously in typically developing populations. So Peter de Villiers and Jill de Villiers take the innovative approach of looking at how these changes unfold in the oral deaf population. So they compared oral deaf children and hearing children's performances in a deception task and also a direct or explicit false belief task alongside their performances in executive functioning and complex language ability. In this case, it was complement syntax mastery. Now, the key results were that oral deaf and hearing children did not differ in either the executive functioning performance or deception task performance. But most critically, the deaf participants were significantly delayed on direct false belief test performance. Now, the critical results were that in both groups, the hearing group and the deaf group, false belief understanding was strongly related to understanding of complex language. In this case, it was complement syntax mastery, but not to conflict inhibition. However, deception performance was strongly related to executive functioning performance, but not complex language. So the upshot for Peter de Villiers and Jill de Villiers is that responses to deception tasks, which they see to be on par with indirect looking responses in false belief tasks, and they view that both deception tasks and indirect looking, they can be handled by the situation action behavior rules that Joseph was just telling us about. So as such, Peter and Jill contend that complex language allows for the representation of genuine belief understanding, and this enables children to pass the traditional traditional false belief tests. So the key point, and this is perhaps going to be controversial, but based on, say, language determining thought, they make the point that performance on indirect false belief tests that escapes the requirements of linguistic propositional representation is going to be so much less sophisticated. Now, links to research on language and executive functioning aside, the issue of implicit and explicit theory of mind also has relevance to our comparative psychology colleagues, which Joseph will talk about next.
Yeah, the last chapter by Couchman et al. Deals with metacognition. Now, what is metacognition? Is a term that means thinking about thinking or cognizing about cognition. And it's these days mainly used to a theory of mind applied to oneself. So if one is aware of one's own thoughts, and strangely enough, even though there is a vast literature on children's and now infants' understanding of other people's or other organisms' mind, there is very little research that directly addresses the issue what the children understand about their own mind. And strangely enough, in the animal literature, this has been a booming and fast-growing area in the last 15 years, and they have. It's particularly interesting because, of course, with animals you can't use language, and our main access to our own understanding is if we ask people and they report introspectively what they think goes on inside them. And with infants and animals you can't use those verbal techniques, so it's very interesting to look at the animal paradigms to see whether we can get something out for doing this research with pre-verbal or early verbal infants and children. And so Couchman and all give a very, for the developmental psychologist, very interesting review of the findings, the main findings in this area, and point out some of the methodological difficulties that are reminiscent of the difficulties we have mentioned earlier about showing a false belief understanding in preverbal infants.
So in conclusion, then, all of the papers in this special issue focus or take up the question of why very young children who fail to show understanding of belief on the traditional direct false belief test still, nonetheless, show sensitivity to belief on indirect measures. Now, the answers to this problem turns out to be very complex, and a lot of the papers take the view that it is still perhaps premature to conclude that representational theory of mind is innate. Now, it's important, I think, for readers to get the sense that the theoretical view that infants, toddlers, or young preschoolers in their responses to indirect tasks, their reasoning is based on behavior rules should not be taken as mind-blind behaviorism. And I think a lot of the papers work very hard to put across or emphasize that from very early on, children have acquired sensitivity to at least mind-relevant behavior onto which further understanding can be built, be it through language or through developing more executive functioning. So looking to the future, one potential avenue for further research could be in order to distinguish between positive gain accounts and negative release accounts, would be perhaps to examine whether children's spontaneous behavior in the test situation generalizes across many different belief-inducing situations and perhaps with different purposes as well. So we know that generalization holds to some extent for explicit prediction types of studies, but whether it holds for other measures, for example, across even across different looking time measures, across the from looking time to helping types of measures, or perhaps to interference types of paradigms, there's still a lot of work that can be done in that regard. So in closing, Joseph and I, we've enjoyed editing this special issue for the BJDT, and we invite readers to turn to the specific papers to get for the bigger picture. And also, if anyone has any particular question, to feel free to contact Joseph or myself as well.